Hello, everybody. As you may know, maybe not, I'm not sure, starting next session, Lindenwood instructors are going to be required to do a video, at least one video a week for their students. I think that's a really good idea. So we've been encouraged to maybe practice a little bit at the tail end of this session. And so that's what I'm doing. I thought that rather than kind of going over the same sort of material that I've already talked to you about via announcements, etc. I might read a bit of material and talk a little bit about literary translation. And that's a topic that came up this past week because of reading Barabbas. And I asked you some questions about translations and reading translations and that kind of thing. And so I thought that might be a good kind of a good subtopic to do a little video on. Specifically, though, I want to talk about this book, which I mentioned in a few different posts. So this is William Gass's "Reading Rilke: Reflections on the Problems of Translation." And by the way, this is the master. William H. Gass. This is a great book, too, by the way. Conversations with William H. Gass. It's a compilation of interviews that he did over a number of years. Actually, this is just a small percentage of them. He was a very generous grantor of interviews, and so there are a lot of them out there. There are several online that weren't included in this book. A lot of video interviews that you can find, and I highly recommend it. This is a book that I turn to a lot. I don't know if you can see very easily. It's kind of just filled with annotations and notes and things. I just find a lot of inspiration in what he has to say about writing in particular, but really about literature, about teaching literature, about just art in general. But again, what I really want to focus on were some snippets out of this book. It's really an really interesting book. I shared in the announcement a link to a paper that I did on this book in particular. And so, if you read that paper that I put online and gave you a link to, you know a little bit about it. But otherwise it's kind of a hodgepodge of different kinds of books, all kind of stuck together, which maybe is one of the reasons it never got quite as much attention as some of Gass's other work. It's partly a biography of the German poet Rilke, who was Gass's primary inspiration, as he is mine. So I guess indirectly, Rilke is kind of my inspiration as well. But it's also some of Gass's translations of Rilke's work, and then his discussion of the process of translating Rilke and comparing his translation to the numerous other translations that are out there, etc. But it also talks about just the art of translation in general. And that's kind of what I want to draw from here. I've got a bunch of notes or sticky spaces here, as you can see. But I'll kind of jump around a little bit, read a little bit, maybe try to add a little bit of my own reflection in there. This isn't terribly well rehearsed, so it might be a little bit herky-jerky, but it'll just be like being in the classroom, because that's also generally kind of spontaneous as well. All right, so again, this is talking about the art of translation, but in this little bit here, it's not just about translation, but about just writing in general, writing well, I guess I should say. You know what? I'm going to turn the light on. That'd be useful. Oh my gosh, that makes a big difference. All right, so Gass writes, every line of fine literature forms a secure, seemingly serene, yet unquiet community. As in any community, there are many special interests in the groups which promote them. There are predominating concerns, persistent problems, and, as in the psyche of any individual, or in the larger region of the body politic, there are competing aims, anxieties, habits, anticipations, perplexities, memories, needs, and grievances. When the line is a good one, their clamor is stilled because its constituents are happy, their wants appeased, their aims rather fulfilled. And so he's making a metaphor here, of course, but basically talking about how a sentence or a line of poetry, either, um, is like a community. And like any community, a sentence or a line of poetry is going to have a bunch of competing forces at work. There are going to be words and phrases that want to dominate the sentence. There's going to be all kinds of considerations in terms of the semantics of the sentence and the different connotations of the various words, and there's just all kinds of stuff that is going on when you start to string words together to try to say something. And what Gass suggests here is that fine literature, really well done literature, really good writing, in other words, finds a way to balance all of those constituencies, basically. And so the end result is a sentence that is as harmonious as possible. And this is certainly an idea that I taken from Gass, that every sentence deserves to be finely crafted. So not just the entire poem or the entire short story or the entire novel or the entire essay, but every single sentence, every line, every paragraph, every stanza, etc., needs to be as finely tuned as possible. If you go to the Gass papers, the Gass archive at Washington University in St. Louis, which I've visited several times before the pandemic, I'm anxious to get back there once everything settles down completely. But it's kind of like the Holy Land to me. It's like visiting Jerusalem or something. But his papers are thousands and thousands of pages, and he was just a consummate reviser, rewriter of his work. And so you find just draft after draft after draft of the same sentence, not just the same short story, or the same sentence, the same paragraph. He worked on a typewriter. That he was kind of that age. Eventually, he switched to a computer, of course. Actually, that's one of the things that slowed down the publication of his novel, *The Tunnel*, which he started in 1966 and didn't finish until 1993, something like that. He started it on a typewriter. And then by the time he finished it, computers had come along, and obviously his publisher wanted it on a word processed document. So it had to be completely retyped into the computer, all 1,200 manuscript pages, and then proofread and revised and so forth. But anywho, if you go to the Gass archive, just page after page after page of playing with a single sentence, all kinds of different ways, and then moving sentences around the paragraph, then moving paragraphs around in the story or the essay or whatever it was. He would scan sentences in the margins. Normally we talk about scansion being something related to poetry. But again, in his mind, every time he put words together, whether it was a poem or whether it was a short story or an essay or a book review or whatever, it deserved to have the same careful attention to detail as a poem. So he would scan the individual sentences of a paragraph in the margin, with stresses, stress syllables, unstressed syllables, and play around with that until he got it just right. So anyway, that's what he's talking about here. That in fine literature, he qualifies it. Every bit of every sentence or every line is harmonized somehow. He goes on, when the line is a good one, there is a musical movement to its meaning which binds the line together as if it were one word, yet at the same time articulating, weighing, and apportioning the line to particular parts the way syllables and their sounds and stresses spell a noun or verb while throwing down a pattern of rhythm and meaning like a path to be pursued deeper into the stanza and resonating with what has preceded it, if anything has. These are not naturally harmonious functions, looking forward, looking back, listening back, uniting and differentiating. So again, he said it's not easy, because not only are you trying to construct a line of poetry or a sentence in a short story or a novel or what have you, in this kind of finely crafted way, just within the context of the sentence or the line itself. But it obviously is connected to what came before and everything that's going to come after, and it all has to then harmonize together. So writing well is a lot of work. Let me go on just a bit. Now he's getting into talking about translation in particular. He says, translating is reading of the best, the most essential kind. Then he gets into some specifics about translating Rilke and other German authors and so forth. But let me go over that again. Translating is reading of the best, the most essential kind. Like I said, my limited translation experience is translating sections of Beowulf, and which is a struggle for me to be sure. But I will say that I read that poem and loved that poem in translation, for, I don't know, 25 years or something before I ever tried to translate it myself. And at first, it was a literal translation of just a few lines here and there for my doctoral dissertation. And then eventually I did this literary translation of the Grendel's Mother episode. And those are different sorts of processes in terms of the specifics, a literal versus a literary translation. But the basic process of really getting down to the nitty gritty of what the poem says in the original language, and trying to kind of figure out, okay, why did this translator over here translate this line this way and this one did it that way, and how am I thinking about it? And like I said, in the articles that I wrote about translating that passage, it really does open up your mind to exactly all that's going on in the poem, and it makes you see it in a whole new light and at a deeper level. So translation is just really, really good reading, or a good translation requires really, really good close reading. Going on. It's been frequently said that translation is a form of betrayal. It is a traduction, a reconstitution made of sacrifice and revision. One bails to keep the boat afloat. However, we don't have to give up everything. Neither swans themselves nor their symbolic significance is uniquely German. He's obviously alluding to a stanza he's been writing about in this passage. We won't have to replace them. The reason, its meaning, the reflective power of a pond, these things are easily retained. The central ideas of the stanza, provided we have a proper hold on them, can be transported without loss. There is always something that could get lost in translation. That's kind of a cliche phrase, lost in translation. But Gass says that if you work at it, the central ideas can be transported without loss. So the main stuff of it, the main thing it's trying to say, that you can retain if you really, really work at it. Going on a bit. He says, what we get when we're done is a reading enriched by the process of arriving at it, and therefore really only the farewells to a long conversation. So a reading enriched by the process of arriving at it. So again, the process of translation brings us to a much richer sort of reading of the text. What must not be given up, of course, is quality and tone. This is a line I love in particular. If the translation does not allow us a glimpse of the greatness of the original, it is surely a failure. And most of us fail that way first and foremost, last and out of luck. Again, if the translation does not allow us a glimpse of the greatness of the original, again, maybe it can't capture the whole thing, but we at least need to be able to get a sense of why the original is so great. It is surely a failure, says Gass. Also important, it will usually take many readings to arrive at the right place somewhere amid various versions. Like a ghost, the original will drift. Also a great line. So it will usually take many readings to arrive at the right place. Somewhere amid various versions, like a ghost, the original will drift. So, we have to go over the original text again and again and again before we can get such a firm grasp of it that we can then, through translation, try to give some sense of what the original was like. Okay, let me skip forward just a bit here. Here he's getting into criticizing bad translations, and I guess bad translators, by default, I suppose. And he says, many translators do not bother to understand their texts. That would interfere with their own creativity and with their perception of what the poet ought to have said. They do not wish to become the trumpet through which another's breath blows, and indeed the English horn often overcomes its notes, so we hear it, not Wagner. So it's its sweetness which overcomes us, the way a rich syrup tops a sundae, and we easily miss the cool refinements of line and composition beneath the hot, thick flow of tone. So I'll go on with that idea just a bit, but just to kind of take a step back, many translators do not bother to understand their texts. That would interfere with their own creativity and their own perception of what the poet ought to have said. So, generally speaking, when someone attempts a translation, they are themselves a pretty good writer. Oftentimes, when you look at poetry translations, they are translated by poets who are themselves fine poets and produce fine original poetry of their own. And so it's a very slippery slope when you're translating, not to get too kind of carried away in the process of creativity and sort of make the translation more your own than the original, or to deliberately decide, well, this is what the original says, but I think the poet probably, or the essayist or novelist or whatever you're translating, should have maybe said it this way. And so now I'm going to sort of rectify this problem with the text through my own translation here. And obviously Gass contends, and I think both people would agree, that's not a very good practice. And he goes on to say, and they would rather be original than right. They insist on repainting the stolen horse. It's my translation, in quotes, they say as they sign it, as if their work were the work of art. So again, this idea that what the translator is doing is somehow more important and better than what the original said in the first place. He goes on to say, I don't know how true this is, but he says, translators are on a par with poets when it comes to being mean-spirited. And he gives some examples of that, perhaps. But, we do get into some other issues that Gass doesn't necessarily talk to in this book, and particularly in this chapter, is yes, on the one hand, we don't want the translation to somehow overshadow the original text. But too often, I think, throughout the history of translation, the translators have been anonymous and given short shrift. And there's kind of a big movement afoot in literary translation now to try to make sure that that translators are credited with the work, and that their name ought to appear on the cover of the book, certainly on the title page, etc. Because again, oftentimes the translator is given no credit. It's just as though the book has suddenly morphed into English or whatever language, as if by magic or something. I know, I'm also a publisher, and it's been a few years ago, but I got I did a contract with a translator for a literary text. It ended up not coming together. We couldn't get permission. She couldn't get permission to translate the original text, but we did work out a contract just in case. And one of the things that she insisted on, and I was wholeheartedly in agreement, so it wasn't a difficult negotiation. But she insisted that as part of the contract language, that it stipulated that her name would appear on on the cover and on the title page and that kind of thing. Because apparently in her world, that's not a given. So she definitely wanted to make sure that was going to be part of the book. Like I said, unfortunately, that did not come together for us, but I was certainly willing in terms of publishing that work had we been able to get hold of all the rights that we needed. Um, Let me see here. Oh, this is interesting. This is what I marked this because of this sentence. He says, in my opinion, it is more important that the translator have native like possession of the language into which he or she or they is trying to put the chosen poem. That's interesting, I think. I think, we believe that if say an English language translator is translating a text from French to English, that they should be fluent in French as well as their own native English. But Gass is saying that isn't necessarily the case. They definitely need to be fluent in the language that they're translating the text into, but not necessarily as much of a native speaker, as fluent, I guess, in whatever the original language was. I suspect that he knows that you can fudge that a bit. I mean, you can obviously take all the time in the world you need to look at dictionaries, look at lexicons, talk to native speakers. If the original author is someone you can talk to, then you could talk to them. So you can get plenty of help in terms of interpreting the original language, but ultimately that has to be kind of synthesized through your own fluency, your own proficiency, your own skill with your native language. And I do know professional translators, they translate from a variety of languages, and they're not fluent in all of them. They just figure it out. They just go about the business of figuring out the original text. If it's a text that's been translated before, maybe several times, they certainly avail themselves of that. When I was translating my Beowulf stuff, besides having three huge dictionaries of Anglo-Saxon, English into modern English kinds of things. I also I have dozens and dozens of translations of Beowulf, and they were all spread kind of everywhere. And so I would, do it all. It took me forever. It took me months to translate just those few, 100 lines that I translated because, I would not just look up a given word in one lexicon, but in all of them. And oftentimes they would direct you to footnotes in the text. And most of the time, quite frankly, the footnote wasn't particularly helpful. But sometimes it was, and it was often enough that I felt like I always needed to do that. So if there was a see whatever, I always saw whatever. And like I said, most of the time I was rudely disappointed, but some of the time it really, really helped. And so I couldn't afford not to do that, basically on every word or phrase that I was working on translating. But then I'd also go and, what did Tolkien do with that phrase? What did Liuza do with that phrase? What did, these other dozens and dozens of translators do with that word or that phrase? And then, kind of start to make my own decisions about what do I want to do with it? What do I think is important? What maybe have other translations lost a little bit, which I feel is a shame. And so maybe I want to try to, capture that other translations seem not to have captured that kind of thing. So, those of you who are maybe interested in literary translation, but you think, I can't do that because I'm monoglot. I only know my one language. I only know English or whatever. So there's no way I can do that. Don't sell yourself short. As long as you are a master of English, for example, you certainly could try your hand at other kinds of language, other kinds of original languages, and use your dictionaries, use whatever help you can muster, and you might surprise yourself. You might be able to come up with some pretty interesting stuff. Gass is not fluent by any stretch of the imagination in German, or he wasn't, I should say. Passed away in 2017. But and he made no bones about it. He didn't pretend to be fluent in German, but that's kind of what his point here is. You don't have to be fluent in both languages. When James Joyce was working on translating sections of Finnegan's Wake, for example, into French and Italian, languages which he was fluent in conversationally. He lived in Paris. He lived in Trieste, which, the main language there was Italian when he was there. So he could, go out and talk to people, and he could read in those languages, but yet they weren't his. Didn't feel as fluent, as masterful of them. So he got a team of translators together. He was part of the team. But he definitely recognized that to render as great of a translation of it's the Anna Livia Pluribel section of Finnegan's Wake that I'm thinking of, to render as great of a translation as those languages could render. He needed help. He was going to be an integral part of the process, but he definitely sought other experts and so forth. Interestingly, well, now I'm getting far afield, but that's what I do. The French translation of Anna Livia, he was part of this translation team, and he saw his role as kind of keeping his fellow translators as close to the original text as possible. They kept wanting to kind of get off on sort of linguistic tangents, he felt, and he kind of kept reeling them back in. When they were working on the Italian version of Anna Livia, again, this is a different set of translators, but Joyce is a part of this group as well. He discovered that Italian was actually a better language for what he was trying to do in the first place. And so he kind of abandoned the original text and kind of went about almost writing a whole new version. And it was his co-translators that were having to kind of keep reeling him in. And he said, let's get back to the original text more closely. And he, of course, Joyce pretty much did whatever he wanted. So he ultimately ended up with a Italian version of Anna Livia, which he felt was better than the English version, because Italian just lent itself more readily to what he had been trying to do in the first place in English. So anyway, a little trivia there for you. Let's see. Kind of already covered this, but this kind of talks to translation in general. This is my last point. I know it's almost a half hour here. It's way more than you wanted, probably about 25 minutes. But he says, for every poet we attempt to translate, certain adjustments will have to be made. Equivalence found, sacrifice accepted, and we shall have to decide in each instance. Got a parenthetical I'm going to skip past. Just what element is so essential that a literal transcription must be aimed at? What we dare to seek certain equivalences for instead, when we can afford to settle for similar general impressions and effect, how to unpack the overly compacted, and what must be let go unless luck is with us in order to achieve the rest which must add up to greatness. All right, so a lot of judgments have to be made in the act of translation, and unless you just get really, really lucky, you're going to lose something or two or three somethings in the process, whether it's tone, whether it's rhythm, whether it's this, whether it's that, and you're just going to have to accept that. And that's maybe part of the pain of translation, but it's also part of the fun of it, the joy of it, to think through the process that carefully and to try to arrive at something which at least starts to approach the greatness of the original. All right. Well, I'm going to stop there and see about posting this bad boy. Hope some of this at least was useful. And thanks for listening.